Have you ever been blindsided by someone you loved? Have you ever stood in a room, heart racing, mind spinning, trying to process words that didn't make any sense? What would you do if your own child, the person you gave up everything for, the person you sacrificed your entire life to raise, looked you in the eyes and told you they had gotten married without you? Not just without inviting you, without even telling you it was happening. Margaret was 54 years old when her world collapsed. It happened on a Saturday afternoon in the living room of her son's apartment, surrounded by furniture she had helped him pick out and photographs she had helped him frame. She had been looking forward to this visit for weeks. James and Nicole had been engaged for over a year now, and Margaret had been eagerly waiting for news about the wedding. Every time she called, she asked the same question. Have you set a date yet? Do you need help with anything? And every time she received the same vague answers. We're still figuring it out. These things take time. We'll let you know when we know. Margaret was patient. She didn't want to be one of those mothers, the overbearing kind, the ones who inserted themselves into every decision and made everything about them. She remembered what it was like to be young and in love, wanting to build something that was yours alone. So she waited. She gave them space. She trusted that when the time came, James would include her. They were close, after all, closer than most mothers and sons. She had raised him alone since he was 3 years old, working 2 and sometimes 3 jobs to make sure he had everything he needed. They had been through poverty together, struggled together, heartbreak together. He was her greatest accomplishment, her reason for surviving the hardest years of her life. Of course he would want her at his wedding. Of course he would. That Saturday, Margaret arrived at the apartment with a bottle of wine and a container of James's favorite cookies, oatmeal raisin, the recipe she had perfected over decades of baking for school events and birthday parties. She was smiling when Nicole opened the door. "Hi, sweetheart," Margaret said, stepping inside to give Nicole a hug. "I brought James's favorites. Is he here?" "He's in the bedroom. He'll be out in a minute." Nicole's voice was pleasant enough, but something about her smile seemed different today, sharper, more satisfied. Margaret dismissed the observation. She was probably imagining things. She settled onto the couch, looking around the apartment with pride. Her son had done well for himself. A good job, a nice home, a beautiful fiancé from a wealthy family. She knew Nicole's parents were well off, doctors, both of them, with a house in the suburbs that Margaret had only seen in photographs. They were good people, she assumed. They raised a daughter James loved. That was enough for her. James emerged from the bedroom a few minutes later. He was dressed casually, jeans and a t-shirt, but there was something off about his demeanor. He wouldn't quite meet Margaret's eyes. His smile seemed forced, his shoulders tense. "Hey, Mom," he said, bending to kiss her cheek. "Good to see you." "Good to see you too, honey." Margaret studied his face. "Is everything okay? You seem a little stressed." "I'm fine, just tired. Work has been crazy." He sat down in the armchair across from her, creating distance Margaret noticed but didn't comment on. Nicole settled onto the arm of the chair, her hand resting possessively on James's shoulder. They looked like a photograph, a perfect couple in their perfect apartment, but something about the composition felt wrong, staged. "So," Margaret said, breaking the silence with forced cheerfulness, "I've been meaning to ask, any updates on the wedding? Have you finally set a date? I know it's been a while since we talked about it, but I'm dying to know. I want to make sure I request time off work in advance and—" She stopped. Nicole was smiling at her. That strange, sharp smile, the one that didn't reach her eyes. "Actually," Nicole said, her voice sweet as poisoned honey, "we have some news about that." Margaret's heart lifted. "You've set a date! Oh, that's wonderful! When is it? Spring? Summer? I always thought a summer wedding would be beautiful. Your mother mentioned something about a garden venue, and I thought, we got married yesterday." The words hit Margaret like a slap. For a moment, she was certain she had misheard. Her brain simply refused to process what Nicole had just said. It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. "I'm sorry," Margaret said slowly, her smile frozen on her face. "What did you say?" "We got married." Nicole's smile widened. "Yesterday. It was perfect. Small, intimate, just the way we wanted it." Margaret looked at James, her son, her baby, the boy she had rocked to sleep 1,000 nights, the child she had worked double shifts to feed, the young man she had driven to college orientation with tears streaming down her face because she was so proud of everything he had become. He was staring at the floor. He wouldn't look at her. "James," Margaret whispered, "is that true?" A pause. An eternity compressed into a few seconds of silence. "Yeah, Mom, it's true. We eloped." Eloped. The word echoed in Margaret's skull, hollow and cold. People eloped when they were running away from something, when they didn't want to be found, when they wanted privacy. Her son had eloped. Without telling her, without inviting her, without even telling her it was happening. "I don't understand," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "You've been planning this wedding for a year. We talked about venues. We talked about dates. I asked you every time we spoke if you needed help, and you said—" "We decided we didn't want a big production," Nicole interrupted smoothly. "All that stress, all that expense, it just seemed unnecessary, so we kept it simple. Just us and a few close friends." A few close friends. Not his mother. Not the woman who had given up everything so he could exist. A few close friends. Where was the wedding? Margaret heard herself ask. The question felt like it was coming from someone else, someone far away who was watching this nightmare unfold. "The botanical gardens," Nicole said. "It was beautiful. My parents were there, of course, and my sister. A few of James's friends from work." She paused, her smile never wavering. "It was very intimate." Her parents were there. Nicole's parents had watched Margaret's son get married. They had been in the photographs. They had heard the vows. They had celebrated with champagne and cake and joy. And Margaret, the mother who had raised him alone, who had sacrificed everything for him, who had loved him before anyone else in the world even knew his name. Margaret had been sitting at home, completely unaware that her son was pledging his life to someone else. Something inside her cracked, a fissure running through the foundation of everything she believed about her relationship with James. She had always known on some level that children grew up, that they built their own lives, that mothers had to learn to step back and let go. But this wasn't stepping back. This was being pushed out, erased, deliberately excluded from the most important moment of her son's wedding. "James," Margaret's voice was harder now, more controlled. "Look at me." Slowly, painfully, James raised his eyes, and Margaret saw something in them that made her blood run cold. Guilt. Not just guilt, shame. He knew this would hurt her. He knew it, and he had done it anyway. "Why?" Margaret asked, a single word that carried the weight of 30 years. "It just happened," James said weakly. "We didn't plan—" "Your wife just said her parents were there, her sister, your friends. That sounds planned to me. Mom? Why wasn't I invited to my own son's wedding?" The question hung in the air, like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to burn. Nicole's smile finally flickered, just for a moment, just long enough for Margaret to see something beneath it. Annoyance, maybe, or satisfaction. Like this was exactly what she had wanted. It wasn't personal, Nicole said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. We just wanted to keep it small. We didn't want any drama. Drama? The word hit Margaret like a second slap. She was drama. Her presence at her son's wedding would have been dramatic. She was the problem that needed to be avoided, the obstacle that needed to be eliminated. She looked at James, searching his face for the boy she had raised, the boy who used to make her Mother's Day cards out of construction paper, the boy who had cried on her shoulder when his first girlfriend broke up with him, the boy who had hugged her at his college graduation and whispered, "I couldn't have done this without you, Mom." That boy was gone. In his place was a man who wouldn't meet her eyes, a man who had let someone else convince him that his mother didn't deserve to be at his wedding, a man who had chosen silence over honesty, absence over inclusion, Nicole over Margaret. Margaret stood up. Her legs felt unsteady, but she forced them to hold her weight. "I need to go," she said quietly. "Mom, wait." James started to rise, but Nicole's hand pressed down on his shoulder, keeping him seated. "Let her process," Nicole said softly. "She just needs time." She just needs time. Like Margaret was a child throwing a tantrum. Like this was an overreaction that would pass. Like being excluded from her son's wedding was something she could simply process and move on from. Margaret walked to the door. She didn't look back. She didn't trust herself to speak without breaking down, and she refused to give Nicole the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She picked up her purse, left the wine and cookies on the counter, reached for the doorknob. "Mom," James's voice cracked behind her. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to happen this way." Margaret paused. Her hand rested on the cold metal of the doorknob, her back still turned to her son. "But it did happen this way, James," she said quietly, "and you let it." She opened the door and walked out. The sound of it closing behind her was the loneliest sound she had ever heard. Outside, the afternoon sun was warm and bright, completely indifferent to the devastation happening inside Margaret's heart. She made it to her car before the tears came. They fell silently at first, then in great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. She gripped the steering wheel, unable to drive, unable to think, unable to do anything but feel the weight of what had just happened. Her son had gotten married. Without her, without even telling her, and his wife, the woman he had chosen to spend his life with, had announced it with a smile, a cold, satisfied smile that Margaret would never forget. She didn't know it yet, didn't understand the full scope of what had been done to her, but this wasn't random. It wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't a young couple making an impulsive decision. This was deliberate, calculated, planned. Nicole had spent a year systematically driving a wedge between Margaret and her son. Every vague answer about wedding plans, every intercepted phone call, every subtle criticism planted in James's mind about his clingy mother. It had all been leading to this moment. And Margaret was only beginning to understand how deep the manipulation went. But she would understand in time. And when she did, everything would change. Because Margaret had spent 30 years sacrificing for her son. She knew how to survive, how to fight, how to rebuild when everything fell apart. And she would not let Nicole destroy the bond she had spent a lifetime building, not without a fight.
To understand why that Saturday afternoon shattered Margaret so completely, you need to understand what she had given to get there. You need to understand the life she had lived, the sacrifices she had made, the love she had poured into a child who was now a man who had just broken her heart without even looking her in the eyes. Margaret became a single mother at 24 years old, not by choice, never by choice. She had married young, too young, she realized later, to a man named Daniel who had promised her the world. He was charming, handsome, full of dreams about the life they would build together. She believed every word. They got married in a small ceremony at the courthouse. Her parents didn't approve. They thought she was rushing, thought Daniel was unreliable, but Margaret was in love. She was certain that love would be enough. It wasn't. The first 2 years of marriage were difficult, but manageable. Daniel struggled to hold down a job. He had big ideas, but no follow-through, always chasing the next opportunity instead of committing to anything stable. Margaret picked up the slack, working as a waitress while Daniel waited for his big break. When she found out she was pregnant, she thought it would change things. She thought Daniel would finally step up, become the provider and partner she needed. For a while, he tried. He took a job at a warehouse, started talking about saving for a house, seemed genuinely excited about becoming a father. James was born on a rainy Tuesday in October. Margaret remembered everything about that day. The exhaustion, the fear, the overwhelming love that crashed over her the moment she held her son for the first time. He was so small, so perfect, so completely dependent on her. She looked into his scrunched little face and made a silent promise. I will give you everything I never had. I will protect you. I will never abandon you. She kept that promise. Daniel didn't. It happened when James was 3 years old. Margaret came home from a late shift at the restaurant to find Daniel packing a bag. He didn't look at her when he explained. He had met someone else. He was leaving. He was sorry. Just like that. No warming, no discussion, no concern for the toddler sleeping in the next room who would wake up the next morning asking where Daddy was. What about James? Margaret had asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel had shrugged. Shrugged, like his son was an inconvenience rather than a person. You're a good mom. He'll be fine. He walked out the door with a single suitcase. He left behind a confused toddler, a devastated wife, and $600 in a checking account that was supposed to cover rent, utilities, and food. He never came back. He never called. He never sent birthday cards or child support or any indication that he remembered he had a son. He simply disappeared, as if the 3 years of marriage and the child they had created together had been nothing but a dream he was ready to wake up from. Margaret filed for divorce.
She applied for food stamps, she swallowed her pride and moved back in with her parents for 6 months until she could save enough for a deposit on a tiny apartment. And she worked. God, how she worked. The waitressing job wasn't enough, so she picked up shifts cleaning houses on her days off. When that wasn't enough, she added night shifts at a factory, packing boxes until her hands ached and her back screamed for mercy. She slept 4 hours a night, sometimes 3. She survived on coffee and adrenaline and the fierce, desperate love she felt every time she looked at her son's face. James didn't understand what was happening. He was too young. He asked about Daddy sometimes in the beginning, and Margaret would hold him close and make up stories about how Daddy was on a long trip, how Daddy loved him but couldn't be there right now. Eventually, the questions stopped. Eventually, James stopped remembering there had ever been a father at all. Margaret became everything, mother and father, provider and protector, comforter and disciplinarian. She read bedtime stories when she could barely keep her eyes open. She attended school plays after working double shifts. She learned to fix leaky faucets and change flat tires and do all the things Daniel should have been there to handle. She never dated. There was no time, no energy, and honestly, no interest. She had given her heart to a man once, and he had thrown it away like garbage. She wasn't eager to repeat the experience. Besides, every ounce of love she had belonged to James. It wasn't sacrifice in her mind. It was just life. You did what you had to do for your child. You gave up whatever needed giving up. You found strength you didn't know you had because the alternative, failing your child, was unthinkable. The years passed. The struggles continued, but they evolved. When James started school, Margaret worried about affording supplies and field trips and all the little expenses that added up. When he hit middle school, she worried about bullies and peer pressure and keeping him on the right path. When high school came, she worried about college, how to afford it, how to prepare him, how to give him opportunities she had never had. She saved every spare dollar, took on extra shifts, went without new clothes, without vacations, without anything that was absolutely essential. By the time James graduated high school, valedictorian, a full scholarship to State University, Margaret had exactly $47 in her personal savings account. But her son had a future, and that was worth every empty bank statement, every skipped meal, every night of crying alone in her bedroom because she was so tired and so scared and so alone. James knew, on some level, what his mother had sacrificed. He was a good kid, responsible, hardworking, grateful. He thanked her at his graduation, publicly, with tears in his eyes. Everything I have, everything I am is because of you, Mom. You gave up your whole life for me. I'll never forget that. Margaret had sobbed. Happy tears, finally. Tears of pride and relief and overwhelming love for the young man her little boy had become. She thought the hard part was over. She thought we had survived the worst and now the good times were coming. She was wrong. The good times came, but they brought something Margaret hadn't anticipated. Nicole. James met Nicole during his junior year at the university. She was a year ahead of him, studying pre-law, beautiful in that polished, expensive way that made Margaret feel immediately inadequate. Her family had money, real money, the kind that meant summer houses and European vacations and never having to check the price of anything at a restaurant. When James first brought Nicole home,
Margaret tried so hard to make a good impression. She cleaned her tiny apartment until it sparkled. She cooked her best recipes. She wore her nicest dress, bought at a thrift store, carefully pressed, nothing compared to the designer outfit Nicole arrived in. "Mrs. Mitchell, so nice to meet you," Nicole had said, her smile bright and her handshake firm. "James talks about you all the time." The words were right. The tone was right. But something in Nicole's eyes made Margaret uneasy. A quick flicker of assessment, a subtle sweep over the modest apartment, the thrift store dress, the furniture that didn't match. She recognized that look. It was the look wealthy customers gave her when she cleaned their houses. The look of someone cataloging all the ways you didn't measure up. She dismissed her concerns. She told herself she was being paranoid, projecting her own insecurities onto an innocent young woman. Nicole came from a different world. That didn't make her a bad person. And James clearly adored her. His face lit up when she walked into a room. He listened intently when she spoke. He seemed happier than Margaret had ever seen him. Wasn't that what mattered? Wasn't her son's happiness more than her vague, unsubstantiated discomfort? So Margaret welcomed Nicole. She invited her to holiday dinners, asked about her studies, her family, her plans for the future. She tried to find common ground, to build a relationship that would last. Nicole was always polite, always pleasant, always saying the right things at the right times, but the warmth never came. There was always something held back, something guarded behind that perfect smile. And there were moments, small, easily dismissed, but impossible to completely forget. The time Nicole suggested Margaret might want to dress up a bit more when meeting her parents. The time she laughed at Margaret's suggestion to help with wedding planning, saying, "Oh, that's sweet, but we have professional help for that." The time she forgot to forward the invitation to James's birthday celebration, leaving Margaret to find out about the party from a Facebook photo posted by one of Nicole's friends. Small things. Things that could be explained away as accidents or misunderstandings. Things that didn't seem worth causing conflict over, especially when James was so clearly happy. Margaret kept her mouth shut. She didn't want to be the difficult mother-in-law. She didn't want to create problems in her son's relationship. She had spent 30 years putting James first. Surely she could handle a few uncomfortable moments with his girlfriend. But the moments kept adding up, and the distance between Margaret and her son kept growing. James used to call her every few days. Then it became once a week. Then every other week. He always had excuses. Work was busy, Nicole had planned something, they were traveling for her family's events. Margaret understood. Young couples needed space. She didn't want to be clingy. But sometimes, late at night, when the apartment felt too quiet and the loneliness crept in, she wondered if she was losing him. If the bond she thought was unbreakable was slowly, silently being severed. When James proposed to Nicole after 2 years of dating, Margaret pushed down her concerns and celebrated with genuine joy. Her son was happy. He was building a life. This was what she had worked so hard for, to give him opportunities, to watch him thrive, to see him loved. She threw herself into the engagement with enthusiasm. She offered to help with planning, to contribute what little money she had saved, to do anything needed. Nicole smiled and said they had everything under control. Margaret asked about dates, venues, themes. Nicole gave vague answers and changed the subject.
Margaret tried to schedule dress shopping with the bride. Nicole was always busy. Weeks turned into months. The engagement stretched to a year with no concrete plans Margaret was aware of. She told herself big weddings took time. She told herself Nicole's family probably had their own traditions and timeline. She told herself everything was fine. She told herself lies because the truth was too painful to consider. The truth that was now undeniable. Sitting in her car outside her son's apartment building, tears streaming down her face, Nicole had never intended to include her. Every vague answer, every deflection, every forgotten invitation, it had all been leading to this moment, to a wedding that happened without her, to a daughter-in-law who announced it with a smile designed to wound, to a son who couldn't even look at his own mother, while the woman he married twisted the knife. Margaret had spent 30 years sacrificing for James, giving up her dreams, her comfort, her chance at a life of her own, all so he could have a future. And in return, she had been erased from the most important day of his life, as if she didn't matter, as if she had never existed at all. The pain was unbearable, but beneath the pain, something else was stirring. Something harder, colder, more dangerous. Margaret had survived abandonment before. She had survived poverty and exhaustion and years of carrying a burden no one helped her carry. She built a life out of nothing, raised a child alone, worked until her body screamed for mercy. She was not weak. She was not helpless. She was a survivor, and survivors don't stay down. They get back up. They fight. And they figure out what really happened, no matter how painful the truth turns out to be. Nicole Bennett was not what she appeared to be. On the surface, she was everything a mother might want for her son. Beautiful, educated, successful, from a good family with resources and connections that could open doors James would never have access to otherwise. She smiled at the right moments, said the right things, presented a flawless image of a devoted partner building a future with the man she loved. But beneath that polished exterior was something darker, something calculating, something that had identified Margaret as a threat from the very first meeting and had been working to eliminate her ever since. Nicole came from wealth, but wealth alone didn't define her. What defined her was control, the absolute, unquestioning need to control every aspect of her environment, her image, her relationships. She had learned it from her mother, Victoria, a woman who ran her household like a corporation and her family like employees. In Victoria's world, everything had a purpose. Every relationship served a function. Every person was either an asset to be cultivated or a liability to be removed. Nicole had absorbed these lessons completely. She understood that marriage wasn't just about love, it was about building a life that reflected well on her. It was about curating an image, assembling the right pieces, presenting a picture of success that would make her parents proud and her peers envious. James was a good piece. Handsome, intelligent, hardworking. He had risen from poverty to earn a scholarship to a prestigious university. There was something almost romantic about his story. The self-made man who had overcome adversity. It was the kind of narrative that played well at dinner parties. But Margaret? Margaret was a problem. From the moment Nicole walked into that cramped little apartment and saw the thrift store furniture and the faded family photographs and the woman who had clearly never had a manicure in her life, she knew Margaret didn't fit. Margaret was living evidence of everything James was supposed to have left behind. The poverty, the struggle, the working class background that would raise eyebrows at Nicole's family gatherings. Every time Margaret opened her mouth, Nicole heard an accent that screamed uneducated. Every time she offered to help with something, Nicole saw a woman who didn't understand how things worked in Nicole's world. Every time James looked at his mother with that soft, grateful expression, Nicole felt a flash of something hot and bitter in her chest. Jealousy. Not romantic jealousy, something deeper. Margaret had a hold on James that Nicole couldn't compete with. 30 years of sacrifice and love and shared struggle had created a bond that made Nicole feel like an outsider in her own relationship. When James talked about his childhood, Margaret was the hero of every story. When he faced difficult decisions, his first instinct was to call his mother. When holidays came around, he wanted to spend them in that sad little apartment eating home-cooked meals instead of at Nicole's parents' estate where they belonged. It was intolerable. It had to change. And Nicole was very, very good at making things change. The manipulation started small. So small that even Nicole might not have recognized it as manipulation in the beginning. It started with observations. Gentle, seemingly innocent observations that planted seeds of doubt in James' mind. Your mom called again. That's the third time this week. Don't you think that's a little much? She seems really anxious about the wedding. I hope she doesn't try to take over the planning. I noticed she got upset when we said we couldn't come for Sunday dinner. Does she always guilt trip you like that? The words were carefully chosen. Never overtly critical, never attacking Margaret directly. Just concerned, just curious. Just pointing out patterns that James had never noticed because he was too close to see them. At first, James defended his mother. She's not clingy, she just cares. She's not guilt-tripping, she's just disappointed. That's just how she is. She worries. But Nicole was patient. She didn't push back directly. She just nodded sympathetically, let the conversation move on, and waited for the next opportunity to plant another seed. I'm sure you're right. You know her better than I do. The agreement was disarming. It made James feel heard and understood. It also made him more receptive the next time Nicole raised a concern. Because if she agreed with him most of the time, then surely the time she questions something must be valid, right? Weeks turned into months. The seeds sprouted into doubts. James started noticing things he had never noticed before, or rather things that had never bothered him before, but now seemed significant. His mom did call a lot. She did ask a lot of questions. She did seem disappointed when he couldn't make every dinner and attend every family gathering. He had always interpreted this as love, as the natural concern of a mother who had spent decades with her son as the center of her world. But now, through Nicole's carefully constructed lens, it started to look different. It started to look like neediness, like dependency, like an inability to let go. I just worry about you, Nicole said one night, curled up against him in bed. You've worked so hard to build this life. You've achieved so much, and sometimes I feel like your mom is still trying to keep you in that old life, like she doesn't want you to move forward. She's not like that, James said, but his voice lacked conviction. I know. I'm probably being paranoid. It's just, My therapist says that some parents have a hard time adjusting when their children grow up. They can become controlling without meaning to. Enmeshed, she called it. Therapist. The word carried weight. Professional. Clinical. James didn't know that Nicole had never discussed his mother with any therapist. He didn't know the conversation was invented, the terminology borrowed from articles Nicole had read specifically to use in moments like this. You think my mom is enmeshed? I don't know. I'm not a professional. Nicole's voice was soft, worried, loving. I just want us to be happy, to build our own life without feeling guilty all the time. Don't you want that too? Of course he wanted that. Everyone wanted that. And somehow, wanting independence had become synonymous with pulling away from Margaret. The boundaries started soon after. Nicole framed them as healthy, necessary, signs of a mature adult relationship. We should limit visits to once a month. We need time for ourselves. Maybe don't answer every time she calls. It's okay to call back later. I think it would be better if we didn't discuss our finances with her. She might not understand our situation. Each boundary seemed reasonable in isolation. Each one was presented with love and concern. Each one created a little more distance between James and his mother. Margaret noticed, of course. She noticed the calls that went to voicemail more often, the visits that became shorter and less frequent, the topics that seemed off limits, met with vague answers and quick changes of subject. But when she tried to address it, she became the problem. Mom, you need to respect our boundaries. We're just trying to build our own life. Nicole says it's healthy to have some separation. Nicole says. The phrase appeared more and more in James's vocabulary. Nicole says we should. Nicole thinks it's best. Nicole and I decided. Margaret heard her son's voice, but the words belonged to someone else. Still, she didn't fight back. She told herself this was normal. Children grew up. They built their own lives. They needed space from their parents. Maybe she was being too clingy. Maybe she was having trouble letting go. Maybe Nicole was right, and Margaret needed to step back. She stepped back, and the manipulation intensified. With less frequent contact, James's perception of his mother began to shift. He was no longer experiencing her love firsthand on a regular basis. Instead, he was experiencing Nicole's filtered version. The concerned comments, the gentle criticisms, the framing of Margaret as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be appreciated. Nicole seized every opportunity to reinforce the narrative. If Margaret called during dinner, Nicole sighed dramatically. She never considers that we might be busy. If Margaret asked about the wedding, Nicole rolled her eyes. She's obsessed with this wedding. It's exhausting. If Margaret offered to help with anything, Nicole dismissed it with,
That's sweet, but we have professionals for that. I don't think she understands how these things work. The message was consistent. Margaret was out of touch. Margaret was overbearing. Margaret didn't belong in their sophisticated, upwardly mobile life. And James, who loved his mother but also loved Nicole, found himself caught between two worlds. He wanted to believe both women. He wanted to find a balance that kept everyone happy, but Nicole made it clear, in subtle and not so subtle ways, that balance wasn't possible. I feel like you're always choosing her over us, Nicole said during an argument about Christmas plans. I'm not choosing anyone. I just want to spend part of the holiday with my mom. And what about my family? They've invited us to the cabin. It's a family tradition. Are you going to tell them you'd rather eat dinner in that tiny apartment instead? The implication was clear. Margaret's home was embarrassing. Margaret's traditions were inferior. Choosing Margaret meant rejecting Nicole's family and everything they represented. James gave in. He spent Christmas at the cabin. He called Margaret on Christmas morning, hearing the poorly hidden hurt in her voice, and told himself it was fine. She understood. She wanted him to be happy. One holiday became two. One missed Sunday dinner became a pattern. One unreturned phone call became standard practice. And through it all, Nicole watched with satisfaction as the bond between mother and son stretched thinner and thinner. The wedding planning was the final phase. Nicole had decided long before the engagement was even official that Margaret would not be at her wedding. It wasn't an emotional decision, it was practical. Margaret didn't fit the aesthetic. Margaret would look out of place among her wealthy relatives and influential family friends. Margaret would be a reminder of James's humble origins that Nicole was working very hard to help him forget. But she couldn't simply announce this. Even after months of manipulation, James still loved his mother. Excluding her directly would cause a fight Nicole might not win. So she employed a different strategy: vagueness. Every time Margaret asked about wedding plans, Nicole had an excuse ready. "We're still in the early stages. We haven't decided on a date yet. It's complicated with both families' schedules. We'll let you know when we know." The message to Margaret was, "Wait, be patient. Your invitation is coming." The reality was, there would be no invitation. But Margaret wouldn't know that until it was too late. Meanwhile, Nicole planned the wedding meticulously. She chose a venue, hired vendors, sent invitations to her family and friends, and made arrangements for the guests she actually wanted present. She told James that they were keeping the guest list small. Intimate, she called it. Just family and close friends. James asked about inviting his mother. Nicole tensed. "I thought we talked about this. We talked about keeping it small. We didn't talk about excluding my mom." "I'm not saying exclude her. I'm just saying, think about it. She's going to feel out of place. She's going to be uncomfortable around my family. And honestly, she's going to make the whole thing about her. You know how she gets." "She wouldn't do that." "Really? Every time we're together, she has to bring up how much she sacrificed for you, how hard she worked. It's constant." The accusation stung, because there was a kernel of truth to it. Margaret did talk about the past. She did reference the struggles they had overcome together. But in James's memory, it had never felt like martyrdom. It had felt like love, like shared history, like the foundation of everything he was. Now, through Nicole's lens, it looked like guilt-tripping, manipulation, a mother who couldn't let go of her role as provider and protector. "I just want our wedding day to be about us, not about your mom and her feelings. Is not so wrong?" James struggled. He genuinely struggled. Part of him knew that excluding his mother was wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong. But another part of him was exhausted from navigating the constant tension. Maybe Nicole was right. Maybe Margaret would make things complicated. Maybe it was better to keep things simple, to elope, to avoid the drama altogether. What if we just didn't have a big wedding? Just something small, private. Nicole's eyes lit up. This was exactly what she had been guiding him toward. "I love that idea. Just us. No stress, no family politics. We'd still tell people, though, right? After. Of course. We'll announce it after. Everyone will understand. These days, lots of people elope. It's romantic." What Nicole didn't say, everyone would understand except Margaret. And by the time Margaret found out, it would be too late. They got married on a Thursday afternoon in the Botanical Gardens. Nicole wore a designer dress. James wore a tailored suit. Nicole's parents were there, beaming with approval. Her sister served as maid of honor. A handful of James's work friends attended, handpicked by Nicole for their presentability and discretion. It was beautiful, intimate, perfect. And somewhere across town,
Completely unaware that her only child was pledging his life to someone else, Margaret was sitting in her tiny apartment alone, watching television, wondering why James hadn't called her back about their plans for the weekend. Nicole had won. She had spent a year systematically dismantling the bond between mother and son, replacing 30 years of love with doubt and distance. She had convinced James that her mother was a burden, that his past was something to be ashamed of, that building a future meant abandoning the woman who had sacrificed everything for him. And the cruelest part? James didn't even fully understand what had happened. He thought he was making his own choices. He thought he was building a healthy, independent life with the woman he loved. He had no idea he was a puppet, dancing on strings held by someone who never loved him for who he was, only for who she could mold him into. But strings eventually become visible. Puppets eventually start to see. And the truth, no matter how carefully buried, has a way of rising to the surface. The days following the revelation were the darkest Margaret had experienced since Daniel walked out that door 30 years ago. She moved through her apartment like a ghost, going through the motions of living without actually feeling alive. She woke up each morning with a split second of peace before the memory crashed over her like a wave. James got married without me. Every time it felt fresh. Every time it stole her breath. She called in sick to work, something she had never done in 20 years unless she was genuinely ill. She couldn't face people, couldn't make small talk with coworkers, couldn't pretend everything was fine when her entire world had collapsed. The apartment felt different now. Every photograph of James seemed to mock her. The baby pictures, the school portraits, the graduation photos. 30 years of memories captured in frames, documenting a relationship she had believed was unbreakable. Had it all been a lie? Had she imagined the closeness, the gratitude, the bond she thought they shared? Or had something stolen it from her, slowly, invisibly, until there was nothing left? She replayed the conversation in her mind obsessively, searching for clues she might have missed. Nicole's smile, the way she had said, "We got married yesterday," with such casual satisfaction, like she was announcing they had tried a new restaurant. The glint in her eyes that Margaret now recognized as triumph. And James, her James, the boy who used to run to her when he scraped his knee, the teenager who had chosen her as his date for the mother-son dance when his friends were embarrassed to be seen with their parents, the young man who had cried at his graduation and credited her with everything he had achieved. That James had sat there, staring at the floor, unable to meet her eyes, while his wife announced that Margaret had been deliberately excluded from the most important day of his life. 3 days after the revelation, Margaret finally reached for her phone. Her hands were shaking as she scrolled to James's name. She had to hear his voice, had to understand what had happened, had to give them a chance to explain. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then, "Hi, you've reached James Mitchell. Leave a message and I'll get back to you." Voicemail. Margaret closed her eyes, fighting back tears. "James, it's Mom. I need to talk to you. Please call me back. I love you." She hung up and waited. An hour passed, then 2, then the entire day. He didn't call back. She tried again the next morning. Same result. Voicemail. No return call. On the 3rd attempt, something different happened. The phone only rang once before clicking to voicemail, the telltale sign of a call being deliberately declined. Her son had seen her name on the screen and chosen not to answer. The rejection cut deeper than anything Nicole had said. This wasn't Nicole ignoring her. This was James, her son, actively avoiding her. Margaret set down the phone and stared at the wall for a long time, trying to understand how she had arrived at this moment. What had she done wrong? How had she failed so completely that her own child couldn't even bear to speak to her? A week later, a text finally arrived. Not a call, not a visit, just cold words on a screen. Mom, I think we all need some time to cool down. Nicole and I are settling into married life, and we need space to do that without drama. I'll reach out when I'm ready. Please respect our boundaries. Our boundaries. Nicole's words coming through James's phone. Margaret recognized the language, the framing, the careful positioning of her attempt to reconnect as drama that needed to be managed. She wanted to scream. She wanted to drive to their apartment and pound on the door until James faced her. She wanted to shake him and demand to know what had happened to the son she raised. Instead, she sat on her couch and cried until she had no tears left. Because what could she do? Force him to talk to her? Show up uninvited and prove Nicole right about her being difficult and overbearing? Every option felt like a trap. Every response would be twisted into evidence that Margaret was the problem. So she did the only thing she could think of. She waited. And she prayed that somewhere inside the stranger her son had become, the real James was still there, waiting to wake up. The weeks that followed were an exercise in survival. Margaret returned to work, forcing herself through each day with a smile she didn't feel. Her coworkers noticed something was wrong. She had lost weight, her eyes were ringed with exhaustion, her usual warmth had dimmed to something barely functional. "Everything okay, Margaret?" Her friend and coworker Diane asked one day during lunch break. "You seem different lately." Margaret considered lying. It would have been easier. But Diane had been her friend for 15 years, and Margaret was so tired of carrying this alone. "My son got married," she said quietly. "Without telling me, without inviting me. I found out when his wife announced it after the fact." Diane's sandwich stopped halfway to her mouth. "What?" Margaret told her everything. The engagement, the vague answers about wedding plans, the Saturday afternoon revelation, Nicole's satisfied smile, James's inability to meet her eyes, the ignored phone calls, the cold text about boundaries. By the time she finished, Diane looked like she was ready to commit a felony. "That's not normal," Diane said firmly. "I don't care what anyone says. A man doesn't just exclude his mother from his wedding for no reason. Something is going on with that woman." "Nicole." Margaret said the name like it tasted bitter. "Nicole." Diane shook her head slowly. "I've seen this before. My cousin married a woman like that. Controlling, manipulative, isolated him from everyone who loved him, took years before he finally saw what she really was." "What happened?" "He divorced her, but not before she had convinced him that his entire family was toxic and tried to take him for everything he had." Diane reached across the table and squeezed Margaret's hand. "I'm not saying that's definitely what's happening here, but I am saying you shouldn't blame yourself. Some people are very, very good at getting inside someone's head. And if this Nicole wanted you out of the picture..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. The possibility had been circling Margaret's mind for weeks, but she hadn't been able to fully embrace it. It felt like an excuse, a way of avoiding examining what she might have done wrong. But looking at those wedding photos, at the planned venue, the professional photographer, the carefully curated guest list, this wasn't spontaneous. This wasn't an accident. This was a planned event with a venue and a photographer and guests, just not the guest who had raised the groom. Margaret stared at the photos until her vision blurred with tears. She zoomed in on James's face, searching for something, maybe guilt or hesitation, but all she saw was a smile. A genuine, happy smile directed at the woman beside him. He looked content. He looked like a man who had everything he wanted. And Margaret was nowhere to be seen. She closed the app and set down her phone. For a long moment, she just sat there, letting the pain wash over her. Then something shifted. The grief was still there, crushing and constant, but beneath it, something harder was emerging, something that felt almost like clarity. She remembered what Diane had said. Some people are very, very good at getting inside someone's head, and if this Nicole wanted you out of the picture... Margaret had spent weeks blaming herself, wondering what she had done wrong, questioning every interaction, every comment, every moment where she might have pushed James away. But looking at those wedding photos, at the planned venue, the professional photographer, the carefully curated guest list, this wasn't spontaneous. This wasn't an accident. This was a planned event with a venue and a photographer and guests, just not the guest who had raised the groom. Margaret didn't have proof. She didn't have recordings or documents or confessions. All she had was a gut feeling that had been screaming at her since the first time Nicole's eyes swept over her apartment with barely concealed disdain. But that gut feeling was getting louder, and Margaret was finally ready to listen. She wasn't going to force James to talk to her. She wasn't going to show up uninvited and prove Nicole right about her being difficult and overbearing. Every option felt like a trap. Every response would be twisted into evidence that Margaret was the problem. So she did the only thing she could think of.
She waited, and she prayed that somewhere inside the stranger her son had become, the real James was still there, waiting to wake up. The weeks that followed were an exercise in survival. Margaret returned to work, forcing herself through each day with a smile she didn't feel. Her coworkers noticed something was wrong. She had lost weight. Her eyes were ringed with exhaustion. Her usual warmth had dimmed to something barely functional. "Everything okay, Margaret?" her friend and coworker Diane asked one day during lunch break. "You seem different lately." Margaret considered lying. It would have been easier, but Diane had been her friend for 15 years, and Margaret was so tired of carrying this alone. "My son got married," she said quietly, "without telling me, without inviting me. I found out when his wife announced it after the fact." Diane's sandwich stopped halfway to her mouth. "What?" Margaret told her everything. The engagement, the vague answers about wedding plans, the Saturday afternoon revelation, Nicole's satisfied smile, James's inability to meet her eyes, the cold text about boundaries. By the time she finished, Diane looked like she was ready to commit a felony. "That's not normal," Diane said firmly. "I don't care what anyone says. A man doesn't just exclude his mother from his wedding for no reason. Something is going on with that woman." "Nicole." Margaret said the name like it tasted bitter. "Nicole." Diane shook her head slowly. "I've seen this before. My cousin married a woman like that. Controlling, manipulative, isolated him from everyone who loved him. Took years before he finally saw what she really was." "What happened?" "He divorced her, but not before she had convinced him that his entire family was toxic and tried to take him for everything he had." Diane reached across the table and squeezed Margaret's hand. "I'm not saying that's definitely what's happening here, but I am saying you shouldn't blame yourself. Some people are very, very good at getting inside someone's head.
And if this Nicole wanted you out of the picture, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. The possibility had been circling Margaret's mind for weeks, but she hadn't been able to fully embrace it. It felt like an excuse, a way to avoid examining what she might have done wrong. But hearing it from someone else, someone who had no stake in making Margaret feel better, gave the idea weight. What if this wasn't about her? What if James's transformation from devoted son to distant stranger hadn't happened naturally? What if someone had engineered it? Margaret started paying closer attention. She began scrolling through Nicole's social media, accounts she had only glanced at before, not wanting to seem like a prying mother-in-law. What she found made her stomach turn. Photographs from the wedding. Not dozens, Nicole was too careful for that, but enough. Professional shots from a botanical garden venue. Nicole in a stunning designer gown. James in a perfectly tailored suit. Nicole's parents beaming in the background, her sister holding a bouquet, a small crowd of well-dressed guests raising champagne glasses. It wasn't an elopement. It wasn't a spontaneous decision. It was a planned event with a venue and a photographer and guests, just not the guest who had raised the groom. She stared at the photos until her vision blurred with tears. She zoomed in on James's face, searching for something. Maybe guilt or hesitation? But all she saw was a smile, a genuine, happy smile directed at the woman beside him. He looked content. He looked like a man who had everything he wanted. And Margaret was nowhere to be seen. She closed the app and set down her phone. For a long moment, she just sat there, letting the pain wash over her. Then something shifted. The grief was still there, crushing and constant. But beneath it, something harder was emerging. Something that felt almost like clarity. She remembered what Diane had said. Some people are very, very good at getting inside someone's head. And looking at those wedding photos, at the planned venue, the professional photographer, the carefully curated guest list, she knew this wasn't spontaneous. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. And if it was deliberate, then someone had planned it. Someone had decided that Margaret didn't belong. Someone had orchestrated her exclusion with the same precision they had applied to selecting flowers and seating arrangements. Nicole. She didn't have proof. She didn't have recordings or documents or confessions. All she had was a gut feeling that had been screaming at her since the first time Nicole's eyes swept over her apartment with barely concealed disdain. But that gut feeling was getting louder. And Margaret was finally ready to listen. She wasn't going to force James to talk to her. She wasn't going to show up at their door and make a scene. She wasn't going to give Nicole any ammunition to use against her. Instead, she was going to wait and watch and pay attention to every detail, every interaction, every word that came out of Nicole's carefully crafted mouth. Because the truth always comes out eventually. Liars slip up. Manipulators overreach. People who build their lives on deception eventually find that the foundation crumbles. Margaret had survived abandonment before. She had survived poverty and exhaustion and years of single motherhood. She had built a life from nothing and raised a son who had once been the best thing about her existence. She could survive this too. And when the truth finally emerged, when James finally saw what Nicole really was, Margaret would be there. Not to say, "I told you so," not to demand apologies or explanations, just to be there. The way she had always been there. The way she always would be. No matter how much it hurt. The truth came to Margaret 3 months after the wedding, in the most unexpected way possible. She had settled into a new rhythm by then, not a happy one, but a sustainable one. She went to work. She came home. She ate dinners alone in front of the television. She checked her phone obsessively, hoping for a message from James that never came. She cried less frequently now, but the grief had simply transformed into something quieter and more permanent. A constant ache that lived behind her ribs and reminded her every morning that her son was gone. Not dead, not physically absent, just gone. The man who used to call her every few days, who used to bring her flowers on Mother's Day and insist on spending Christmas morning in her tiny apartment eating the cinnamon rolls she had made since he was a child, that man had disappeared. In his place was a stranger who sent occasional texts filled with Nicole's carefully crafted language about boundaries and space and healthy separation. Margaret had stopped responding to those texts. What was the point? Every reply was filtered through Nicole. Every attempt at connection was met with another wall. So she waited, watched, and tried to rebuild some semblance of a life that didn't revolve entirely around a son who no longer seemed to want her in his. It was a Saturday afternoon in early spring when everything changed. Margaret had forced herself to leave the apartment, something Diane had been encouraging her to do for weeks. She had gone to the farmer's market downtown, wandering between stalls of fresh produce and homemade crafts without really seeing any of it. And then she heard a voice she recognized. "Mrs. Mitchell, is that you?" Margaret turned. Standing in front of a booth selling artisanal honey was a young man she hadn't seen in years, but recognized immediately. Kevin Chen, one of James's best friends from high school. They had been inseparable during their teenage years, studying together, playing video games in Margaret's living room, raiding her refrigerator after football practice. Kevin had been at every birthday party, every graduation, every significant moment of James's adolescence. "Kevin!" Margaret felt a genuine smile cross her face for the first time in weeks. "Oh my goodness, look at you! You look wonderful!" Kevin grinned, wrapping her in a warm hug. "It's so good to see you, Mrs. Mitchell. It's been forever." "It really has. What are you doing back in town? I thought you moved to Seattle after college." "Just visiting family for a few weeks. My mom's birthday is next weekend." He pulled back, studying her face with sudden concern. "Hey, are you okay? You look tired." Margaret's smile faltered. "I'm fine, just busy with work, you know." Kevin didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. Instead, he said something that made Margaret's heart clench. "I was really sorry I couldn't make it to the wedding, by the way. I had a work thing I couldn't get out of. But I saw the photos on Facebook. Looked like a beautiful ceremony." Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Kevin had been invited. Kevin, James's high school friend who he hadn't seen in years, had been invited to the wedding. But Margaret hadn't. She must have gone pale because Kevin's expression shifted from casual to concerned. "Mrs. Mitchell? Are you okay? You were invited to the wedding?" Kevin's brow furrowed. "Yeah, I got an invitation a few months before. Like I said, I couldn't make it because of work, but..." He stopped abruptly, reading something in her face. "Wait, why are you asking? You were there, right? I mean, you're James's mom. Of course you were there." Margaret couldn't speak. Her throat had closed. Tears were burning behind her eyes, and she was desperately trying not to fall apart in the middle of a farmer's market in front of her son's old friend. Kevin's face went through several transformations. Confusion, then disbelief, then horror. "Oh my God," he said quietly. "You weren't there. You weren't invited." Margaret shook her head. Just barely. A tiny movement that confirmed Kevin's worst suspicion. That's That's insane. Kevin ran his hand through his hair, looking genuinely shaken. Why wouldn't... how could he... Mrs. Mitchell, I don't understand. James worships you. He talked about you constantly in high school. You were like a superhero to him. I don't know what happened, Margaret whispered. One day he was my son, and then... Nicole. Kevin's expression darkened at the name. Something flickered across his face. Recognition, maybe. Or confirmation. Nicole, he repeated. Right. I've heard some things about her. Margaret's heart started pounding. What things? Kevin hesitated, glancing around like he was worried about being overheard. Look, I don't want to cause drama or anything, but can we go somewhere and talk? I feel like there's a lot you don't know, and honestly, some things I don't know either. But maybe between the two of us... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Margaret nodded immediately. There's a coffee shop around the corner. We can go there. 10 minutes later, they were seated at a corner table with 2 untouched cups of coffee between them. Kevin was still processing, his expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. I can't believe he didn't invite you. I literally cannot believe it. When I got that invitation, I just assumed, obviously his mother would be there. That's not even a question. Tell me what you know, Margaret said quietly. About Nicole. About what you've heard. Kevin sighed heavily. I should tell you up front, I'm not as close to James as I used to be. We've drifted apart over the years. Different cities, different lives. You know how it goes. But I still talk to some of our old friends from high school. And through them, I've heard things. What kinds of things? Well, first of all, I should tell you about the wedding itself. One of our friends, Marcus, was actually there. He told me about it a few weeks later when we caught up for drinks. Kevin took a breath. He said James looked happy, but also anxious. Like he kept glancing around, expecting someone to show up. Marcus said he asked James about you, said something like, "Your mom must be so proud." And James just froze, changed the subject, wouldn't talk about it. Margaret tightened her hands around her coffee cup. He was looking for me. He was waiting for me to show up. That's what Marcus thought too. But here's the thing. Nicole was right beside him the whole time. Every time James seemed distracted or uncomfortable, she would touch his arm or whisper something in his ear. And then he would smile again, like she was resetting him somehow. The image was chilling. I could picture it perfectly. Nicole's hand on James's arm, steering him away from his own emotions, redirecting him towards the narrative she had constructed. Marcus also told me something else. A few days before the wedding, he ran into James at a bar. Just the two of them. James had been drinking, and he was emotional. He started talking about his mom, about how much he missed talking to you, about how he felt like he was losing himself. What did he say exactly? He said... Kevin hesitated, looking pained. He said, "Sometimes I don't even know who I am anymore. Nicole has all these ideas about who I should be, who we should become, and I want to make her happy, but I look in the mirror and I don't recognize myself." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. She didn't bother to wipe them away. Did Marcus ask about the wedding? About me? He tried. He asked if you were going to be there, and James just shut down. Said Nicole thought it was better to keep things small, to avoid family drama. But Marcus said the way he said it, it didn't sound like James agreed. It sounded like he was reciting something he had memorized. Kevin leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Mrs. Mitchell, I've known James since we were 14 years old. He's not the kind of guy who would abandon his mother. He's not the kind of guy who would choose impressing people over being loyal to family. Whatever has happened to him, it's not who he really is. I know that's not who he is, but I don't know how to reach him. Every time I try to contact him, Nicole is there, filtering everything, controlling the narrative. There's something else you should know. Kevin's voice grew even more serious. Marcus told me about a fight James and Nicole had the night before the wedding. She didn't know Marcus was nearby. He was in the hallway outside their hotel room and overheard through the door. Margaret's heart was pounding. What happened? James wanted to invite you. Apparently he had been fighting for it for weeks, trying to convince Nicole to change her mind. The night before the wedding, he brought it up again, said he couldn't do this without his mother there, that it felt wrong. Kevin paused, his expression dark. And Nicole said, and this is a direct quote according to Marcus, "If she comes, I'm not walking down that aisle. Make your choice." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. An ultimatum. Nicole had given James an ultimatum on the night before his wedding. Choose me or your mother. And James, exhausted for months of manipulation, worn down by constant pressure, desperate not to lose the woman he thought he loved, James had chosen. He didn't want to exclude you, Kevin said quietly. He fought for you. But she made him feel like he had to choose. And by that point, she had been in his head for so long that he couldn't see any other option. Margaret pressed her hands against her face, sobbing openly now. All this time, she had blamed herself, questioned what she had done wrong, wondered if she had pushed James away through some failure of motherhood she couldn't identify. But it wasn't her. It had never been her. It was Nicole. Every cold text, every unreturned phone call, every mention of boundaries and space, all of it was Nicole's architecture. James was a prisoner in his own marriage, isolated from everyone who truly loved him, controlled by a woman who had systematically dismantled his identity. "There's one more thing," Kevin said gently, "and I think this is important." Margaret lowered her hands, tears still streaming. "What?" Marcus said that after the wedding, James seemed different. Not happy different. Defeated different. He stopped reaching out to old friends. He stopped posting on social media. His whole personality seemed to dim, like someone had turned down the brightness on who he used to be. Kevin met her eyes with fierce determination. That's not a man who got what he wanted. That's a man who gave up something essential and is slowly losing himself because of it. Margaret absorbed this, feeling the pieces click into place like a terrible puzzle. "He's not happy," she said quietly. "Not really." "No, I don't think he is. And I think, deep down, he knows he made a mistake. He just doesn't know how to admit it. Or maybe Nicole won't let him." Kevin reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Look, I don't know what you should do with any of this. I'm not going to tell you to forgive him or to give up on him. That's not my call. But I wanted you to know the truth. James didn't choose to abandon you. He was manipulated into it. And somewhere inside that marriage, your real son is still there. Probably hurting, probably lost, but still there." Margaret nodded slowly, wiping her eyes. The pain hadn't disappeared. If anything, it had deepened. But something else had joined it now. Clarity. She finally understood what had happened. Why her son had seemed to transform overnight. Why the wedding had been a secret. Why every attempt at connection had been blocked and redirected. And she understood something else too. James needed her, maybe more than he ever had before. He was trapped in a relationship with someone who was systematically erasing who he was, and he didn't know how to escape. But Margaret knew what it felt like to be trapped. She had been trapped in a marriage with Daniel before he abandoned her. She had been trapped in poverty, in exhaustion, in circumstances that seemed impossible to overcome, and she had survived. She had clawed her way out. She had built a life for herself and for James, against every odd, through sheer determination and love. If James was lost, she would find him. If he was trapped, she would help him escape. If Nicole thought she had won, thought she had successfully severed the bond between mother and son, she was about to learn how wrong she was. Margaret looked at Kevin with new fire in her eyes. "Thank you," she said firmly, "for telling me all of this. I needed to know. What are you going to do?" "I'm going to wait for my son to reach out, and when he does, because I believe he will, I'm going to be ready. I'm going to help him remember who he is." She stood up, leaving her untouched coffee on the table. "And Nicole is going to learn that she should never have underestimated the woman who raised the man she's trying to destroy." The call came 6 months after the wedding. 6 months of silence, of waiting, of Margaret rebuilding herself piece by piece while never giving up hope that somewhere inside his controlled existence, her son was still fighting to break free. It was a Tuesday evening, just past 9 o'clock. Margaret was sitting on her couch, reading a book Diane had recommended, part of her ongoing effort to fill her life with something other than grief. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She almost ignored it. Probably a spam call, or Diane checking in, or one of those automated messages about car warranties. Then she saw the name on the screen. James. Her heart stopped. For a moment, she just stared at it, watching the phone vibrate against the wood, certain she was hallucinating. James hadn't called in 6 months. He had sent exactly 3 texts in that time, all of them cold, distant, filled with Nicole's language about space and boundaries. He didn't call. He didn't reach out. He had become a ghost, and now his name was glowing on her screen. Margaret's hand trembled as she picked up the phone. "Hello?" Silence on the other end. Then a shaky breath. "Mom?" James's voice broke on the single syllable, and Margaret knew, instantly, viscerally, with every fiber of her being, that something had changed. "James? I'm here. I'm right here." He stopped. Started again. "I don't know why I called. I needed to hear your voice." Margaret closed her eyes, tears already streaming. 6 months of silence, and he needed to hear her voice? Whatever wall Nicole had built around him, it was cracking. "You can always call me," Margaret said softly. "No matter what, no matter how much time has passed. I'm always here." "I know." His voice was hoarse, raw. "I know, Mom. I've always known. I couldn't—" He trailed off, unable to finish. Margaret waited. She had learned patience in the months since the wedding. She had learned that pushing only made people retreat, that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply hold space for someone to find their own words. "Can we meet?" James finally asked. "Just us. I need to talk to you. There's so much I need to say." Margaret's heart soared, even as it ached. "Of course. Anywhere. Anytime. Just name it." "There's a coffee shop downtown. The one we used to go to after my dentist appointments when I was a kid. Remember?
You used to let me get hot chocolate with extra whipped cream. Margaret remembered. Of course she remembered. Every Saturday morning for years, that coffee shop had been their special place, their ritual. The memory was so vivid, she could almost taste the hot chocolate. I remember, she whispered. Can you meet me there tomorrow? Around noon. I'll be there. Mom? His voice cracked again. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. For everything. Margaret gripped the phone tighter, her own voice breaking. We'll talk tomorrow. Just come. That's all that matters. Just come. After they hung up, Margaret sat motionless for a long time. The book had fallen to the floor, forgotten. Her hands were still shaking. He had called. After 6 months of silence, after the wedding she wasn't invited to, after all the manipulation and distance and pain, he had called. She didn't know what had happened, didn't know what had finally cracked through Nicole's control, but something had shifted. Something had broken open. And tomorrow she would see her son. The coffee shop looked exactly as Margaret remembered. Same worn wooden tables, same mismatched chairs, same chalkboard menu with hand-drawn illustrations. The only difference was the gray in her hair and the weight she carried in her heart. She arrived 20 minutes early, unable to stay home, unable to do anything but wait. She chose a table in the corner, their old table, the one by the window where they used to watch people walk past while they talked about James's day at school and Margaret's day at work. She ordered hot chocolate, 2 cups, extra whipped cream on both. When the door opened at exactly noon, Margaret looked up, and she barely recognized her son. James had lost weight. His face was gaunt, his cheeks hollow, dark circles carved beneath his eyes like he hadn't slept properly in months. His clothes, usually neat and well-fitting, hung loosely on his frame. He looked like a man who had been slowly disappearing from the inside out. But his eyes, when they found her across the coffee shop, his eyes filled with something that Margaret's heart shattered and soared simultaneously. Recognition, relief, and overwhelming, crushing guilt. He walked towards her table with the hesitant gait of someone approaching a cliff edge. He stopped a few feet away, unable to bridge the final distance, his hands opening and closing at his sides like he didn't know what to do with them. Mom! Just the word. Just her name in his broken voice. Margaret stood. She didn't speak. She just opened her arms, and James, her 30-year-old son, her baby, the man she had raised from nothing, collapsed into her embrace and sobbed like a child. They stood there for a long time, holding each other, not caring about the other customers or the barista behind the counter or anyone else in the world. Margaret stroked his hair the way she had when he was small, murmuring comfort that didn't need words, just sounds and presence, and the simple message, "I'm here. I've got you. You're safe." When they finally sat down, James was still wiping his eyes. The hot chocolate sat between them, untouched, steam curling towards the ceiling. "I don't even know where to start," James said hoarsely. "Start wherever you need to." "I've been so stupid." He shook his head, anger at himself written across his features. "I've been so incredibly, unforgivably stupid, and I've hurt you in ways I can never take back." Margaret reached across the table and took his hands. "Tell me what happened. I want to understand." James was quiet for a moment, gathering himself. Then he began. I think I always knew something was wrong, from the very beginning with Nicole. There were moments, little things she said, ways she reacted that didn't quite fit. But I told myself I was imagining it, that I was lucky to be with someone so smart and beautiful and driven. He swallowed hard. She was so good at making me feel like the problem was always me. If I questioned her, I was being paranoid. If I wanted to spend time with you, I was too attached to my mother. If I expressed any opinion that differed from hers, I was starting conflict. Margaret listened, her heart breaking for the son who had been so thoroughly manipulated by someone who claimed to love him. The wedding, James's voice caught. Mom, I wanted you there. I wanted you there more than anything. I fought for it, for weeks. Every time I brought it up, Nicole had another reason why it was a bad idea. You wouldn't fit in with her family. You might say something embarrassing. You would make the day about yourself instead of about us. None of that is true, Margaret said quietly. I know that now. But at the time, I had been listening to her version of you for so long that I started to believe it. She was in my head. Every thought, every decision, it all went through this filter she had created. And somehow the mother I adored became this burden I needed to manage. Tears were streaming down his face. Margaret's own eyes were burning. The night before the wedding, James's voice caught. Mom, I wanted you there. I wanted you there more than anything. I fought for it, for weeks. Every time I brought it up, Nicole had another reason why it was a bad idea. You wouldn't fit in with her family. You might say something embarrassing. You would make the day about yourself instead of about us. None of that is true, Margaret said quietly. I know that now. But at the time, I had been listening to her version of you for so long that I started to believe it. She was in my head. Every thought, every decision, it all went through this filter she had created. And somehow the mother I adored became this burden I needed to manage. Tears were streaming down his face. Margaret's own eyes were burning. The night before the wedding, James said hoarsely, I told her I couldn't do it. I couldn't get married without you there. I said I was going to call you, tell you everything, and if you couldn't make it on such short notice, we would postpone until you could. He paused, struggling to continue. She threatened to leave me, right there.
The night before our wedding, she said if you came, she was walking out, that she couldn't marry a man who was still attached to his mother's apron strings. Those were her exact words. And you chose her, Margaret said. Not accusatory, just factual. I chose her. James's voice was barely a whisper. I was exhausted, Mom. I had been fighting for months, and I was so tired, and she was right there telling me that everything would be perfect if I just let this one thing go. If I just made this one sacrifice. He looked up, meeting her eyes with devastating honesty. So I sacrificed you. I sacrificed the person who had never asked me to sacrifice anything in return. And I've been dying inside ever since. Margaret squeezed his hands tighter. What changed? Why are you here now? Everything fell apart. James laughed bitterly. Once she got what she wanted, me, isolated, cut off from everyone who really knew me, she stopped pretending. The criticism became constant. Nothing I did was good enough. The way I dressed, the way I talked, the friends I had, the career I chose, everything was wrong. He shook his head. She started controlling the finances, monitoring my phone, getting angry if I came home late from work, even by 10 minutes. I couldn't see friends without her permission. I couldn't make decisions about my own life without running them by her first. Margaret felt sick. This wasn't marriage. This was imprisonment. A few weeks ago, I found out she had been reading my emails. Going through my text messages, she knew about every time I almost contacted you and didn't. She knew about every moment of weakness, and she used them against me. Said I was weak, said I couldn't be trusted. said if I really loved her, I would delete your number from my phone entirely. Did you? Margaret asked quietly. I tried. James's voice cracked. I actually tried. I opened my contacts. I scrolled to your name, and I couldn't do it. I sat there for an hour with my finger over the delete button, and I couldn't do it. Because deleting you would mean deleting everything I am, everything you made me. He looked at her with eyes that were finally clear, finally seeing. That's when I realized. That's when I understood what had happened. The woman I married wasn't trying to build a life with me. She was trying to rebuild me into something I was never supposed to be. And if I let her finish, there would be nothing left of the person you raised. Margaret was crying openly now. She didn't try to stop the tears. So what happens now? James took a shaky breath. I'm leaving her. I've already talked to a lawyer. I'm filing for divorce. The word hung in the air between them. Divorce. The end of a marriage that never should have happened. The dissolution of a union built on manipulation and control. Where will you go? I don't know yet. I have to figure out the legal stuff first. Untangle our finances, find my own place. He paused, something vulnerable flickering across his face. I was hoping maybe I could come home for a while, just until I get back on my feet. I know I don't deserve it. I know I don't have any right to ask after what I did, but yes. Margaret cut him off before he could finish. Yes, 1,000 times yes. You can come home. You can always come home. James broke down again. This time, Margaret moved around the table to sit beside him, holding him the way she had held him through every nightmare, every heartbreak, every moment of his life when he needed his mother. I'm so sorry, he sobbed against her shoulder. I'm so sorry, Mom, for everything. For the wedding, for the silence, for believing her over you. I know you're sorry. Margaret stroked his hair gently. And I forgive you. He pulled back, looking at her with disbelief. How can you forgive me so easily, after everything I did? Margaret smiled through her tears. Because I'm your mother. Because I've loved you since before you took your first breath. Because nothing could ever change that. Not Nicole, not time, not any mistake you could ever make. She cupped his face in her hands, looking directly into his eyes. But I need you to understand something. Forgiveness isn't the same as pretending it didn't happen. We have a lot of work to do, a lot of trust to rebuild. I love you unconditionally, but that doesn't mean the wound disappears overnight. We're gonna have to heal together. Honestly, slowly, with a lot of difficult conversations. James nodded solemnly. I understand. Whatever it takes, however long it takes. I'll earn back your trust, Mom. I promise. I believe you. I believe you, James, and I'm so proud of you for waking up, for choosing yourself, for coming back. They sat together in that coffee shop for hours, talking about everything and nothing, rebuilding the bridge that Nicole had tried to burn. The hot chocolate grew cold, the afternoon light shifted through the windows, and slowly, piece by piece, mother and son began to find their way back to each other. When they finally left, walking out into the evening air together, James paused on the sidewalk. Mom? Yes? I should have been at your side my whole life. I should never have let anyone come between us. But from now on, I'm going to be the son you deserve, the son you raised me to be. Margaret smiled at her boy,
her precious, broken, beautiful boy who had finally found his way home. That's all I've ever wanted. Just you. Just my son. Just exactly who you are. They walked to their cars together, making plans to meet again the next day and the day after that, and all the days that would follow. The road ahead would be long. There would be lawyers and divorce proceedings, and the messy work of James reclaiming his independence. There would be difficult conversations and painful memories and moments when the hurt would resurface unexpectedly, but they would face it together, the way they had faced everything else in their lives. Mother and son. Unbreakable. And Nicole, the woman who had tried to destroy that bond, would soon learn that some ties can never be severed, no matter how hard you try.
The divorce took 8 months. 8 brutal, exhausting months of lawyers and paperwork, and Nicole fighting for every asset, every dollar, every piece of the life she had tried to build on a foundation of control and manipulation. Nicole did not go quietly. When James first told her he was leaving, she had cycled through every tactic in her arsenal. First came the tears, the dramatic sobbing, the declarations of undying love, the promises that she would change, that things would be different, that they could work through this together. When the tears didn't work, she shifted to guilt. How could he do this to her? After everything she had sacrificed, after she had given up so much to build a life with him, didn't he understand how embarrassing this would be for her family? When guilt failed, she moved to threats. She would destroy him financially. She would tell everyone what a terrible husband he had been. She would make sure he never recovered from the shame of abandoning his wife. And when threats didn't break him, she tried one final manipulation, the one that had always worked before. If you leave me, you'll lose everything. Your mother can't save you. You'll be alone. You need me, James. You've always needed me. But James wasn't the same man who had stood frozen at that wedding, unable to defy her ultimatum. Something had shifted inside him. Something had hardened and healed simultaneously. He looked at the woman he had married, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time, and saw not the brilliant, beautiful partner he had convinced himself she was, but the controlling, manipulative person she had always been. "I don't need you," he said quietly. "I never needed you. I just forgot who I was. But I remember now." He walked out of their apartment that night with a single suitcase, just like his father had walked out 30 years earlier. But unlike Daniel, James wasn't abandoning anyone. He was rescuing himself. Margaret was waiting for him when he arrived at her door. She had prepared his old bedroom, the room that had been converted to a guest room years ago, but still held echoes of his childhood. She had put fresh sheets on the bed, stocked the bathroom with toiletries, and filled the refrigerator with his favorite foods. When she opened the door and saw him standing there, exhausted, scared, but finally free, she pulled him into her arms without a word. He stayed with her for the entire 8 months of the divorce proceedings. At first, he was barely functional. Years of psychological manipulation had left scars that weren't visible, but ran deep. He slept erratically, sometimes not at all. He flinched at loud noises. He apologized compulsively for things that didn't require apologies, as if he had been trained to believe that his very existence was an inconvenience. Margaret watched her son struggle, and her heart broke for him in new ways. This wasn't the grief of exclusion she had felt after the wedding. This was the grief of witnessing someone you love try to piece themselves back together after being systematically dismantled. She didn't push him, didn't demand explanations or emotional breakthroughs. She simply existed alongside him, steady and present, a constant reminder that he was loved unconditionally, something Nicole had never offered. They established small rituals: morning coffee on the tiny balcony, watching the sunrise, evening walks around the neighborhood, just like they used to take when he was a child. Sunday dinners with Diane, who welcomed James back with open arms and a casserole that could feed an army. Slowly, so slowly, James began to return to himself. The weight came back first. Margaret cooked his favorite meals, and he actually ate them, rediscovering an appetite that had been suppressed for years. The color returned to his face. The dark circles faded. He started sleeping through the night again. Then came the laughter. The first time Margaret heard James genuinely laugh, not the polite, performative chuckle he had learned to produce on command, but a real, full-bodied laugh. She had to excuse herself to the kitchen so he wouldn't see her cry. Therapy helped. Margaret had gently suggested it after the first month, and James had agreed without resistance. He saw a counselor who specialized in survivors of emotional abuse, and the work they did together began untangling the years of manipulation that had rewired his brain. "She made me believe I was crazy," James told Margaret one evening after a particularly intense session. "Every time I felt like something was wrong, she convinced me I was imagining it, that I was being paranoid, that I was the problem." He shook his head slowly. "I thought I was losing my mind. Turns out, I was just losing myself." Margaret listened, without interrupting. She'd learned that James needed to process out loud, to externalize the thoughts that had been trapped inside him for so long. The wedding. He paused, still struggling with this particular wound. "She knew exactly what she was doing. She isolated me from you first because you were the biggest threat. You knew me better than anyone. You would have seen through her eventually. So she made me believe that loving you was a weakness I needed to overcome. And now?" Margaret asked gently. "Now I understand that loving you was never the problem. Letting someone convince me to be ashamed of that love, that was the problem." He looked at her with eyes that were clear for the first time in years. "I'm never going to be ashamed of you again, Mom. Never. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, and I'm done letting anyone make me forget that." The divorce was finalized on a gray Thursday in November. James walked out of the courthouse with the papers in his hand, officially free from the marriage that had nearly destroyed him. Nicole had fought for everything, but in the end, she had received far less than she expected. The judge had seen through her manipulations. The evidence of her controlling behavior, text messages, emails, testimony from friends who had witnessed James's transformation had painted a picture that even her expensive lawyer couldn't obscure. She got half of their shared assets, which was fair, but she didn't get the satisfaction of destroying James. She didn't get to control the narrative, and she didn't get to keep him isolated from the mother who had loved him his entire life. Margaret was waiting outside the courthouse when James emerged. She didn't ask how he was feeling. She could see it in his face. Relief, exhaustion, and something else. Hope. "It's over. It's really over," he said quietly. Margaret hugged him right there on the courthouse steps, not caring who saw. "You're free. You're finally free." The months that followed were a genuine rebuilding. James found his own apartment, small but comfortable, close enough to Margaret's place that they could see each other regularly, but far enough that he was establishing his own independence. He threw himself into his career with renewed energy, earning a promotion that had been stalled during the years of his marriage. He reconnected with old friends, Kevin, Marcus, others who had been pushed away by Nicole's influence. He rediscovered hobbies he had abandoned, books he had stopped reading, interests that had been dismissed as unimportant. And he worked every single day on rebuilding his relationship with Margaret. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when the hurt resurfaced unexpectedly. A song that reminded Margaret of the wedding she had missed, a comment that accidentally touched a still tender wound. There were difficult conversations about what happened, why it happened, and how they could prevent it from happening again. But they faced every challenge together with honesty and patience and the deep, unshakable love that had survived everything Nicole had thrown at it. On the 1-year anniversary of James's phone call, the call that had started his journey home, they returned to the coffee shop where they had reunited. Same corner table, same hot chocolate with extra whipped cream, same mother and son, but different. Healed, stronger. "I've been thinking," James said, stirring his drink slowly, "about everything that happened, about how I let Nicole come between us, about what I learned from it all. And I learned that love isn't enough if it doesn't come with respect. Nicole said she loved me, and maybe in her own twisted way she did, but she didn't respect me. She didn't respect my history, my family, my identity. She wanted to erase all of that and create something new, something that belonged to her." He looked up, meeting Margaret's eyes. "You've never tried to erase who I am. You've only ever tried to help me become more of myself. That's real love. That's what I should have recognized from the beginning." Margaret smiled, tears glistening in her eyes now. "You were young. You were in love, and she was very, very good at what she did. That's not an excuse. No, it's not, but it is an explanation. And understanding how it happened is how you make sure it never happens again." James nodded slowly. "I've been seeing someone. Nothing serious yet, just a few dates. But she's different, kind, genuine. She asked about you on our second date.
And when I told her about our history, the whole story, including the wedding, she didn't make excuses for Nicole. She said it was unconscionable. That any partner who tries to separate you from a loving parent is showing you who they really are." Margaret's heart swelled. "She sounds like a good person." "I think she might be." James smiled, a real smile, one that reached his eyes. "But I'm taking it slow. I'm not rushing into anything. I want to make sure I'm healed first. That I'm choosing someone for the right reasons. That's very wise. I learn from the best." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Mom, I know I can never make up for what happened. I can never give you back that day. But I promise you, for whatever time we have left together, I will spend it being the son you deserve. The son you raised me to be." Margaret squeezed his hand, tears flowing freely now. "That's all I've ever wanted. Just you. Just my son. Just exactly who you are." They sat together in that coffee shop for hours, the same way they had a year ago, talking and laughing and healing. The hot chocolate grew cold, the afternoon light shifted, and a mother and son who had been torn apart by manipulation found themselves closer than ever before. That evening, as Margaret walked home alone, she thought about everything she had survived. Daniel's abandonment, decades of single motherhood, the soul-crushing exhaustion of working multiple jobs while raising a child alone, the devastating exclusion from her son's wedding, the months of silence and uncertainty, and now this quiet, hard-won peace. She had lost her son for a time, but she had gotten him back. Not the same as before. Nothing ever stays the same. But somehow better, deeper, more honest. The bond between them had been tested by fire and had emerged stronger for it. Margaret looked up at the evening sky, painted in shades of orange and pink, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Contentment. Not the fragile contentment of someone waiting for the next disaster, real contentment. The kind that comes from surviving the worst and discovering that you're still standing. She thought about other mothers going through similar pain. Women whose children had been manipulated by controlling partners. Women who had been excluded, dismissed, erased from their own children's lives. Women who were sitting alone right now, wondering if their child would ever come back. And she wished she could tell them what she had learned. That love is patient, that waiting doesn't mean weakness, that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is hold your ground and trust that the bond you built will eventually pull your child back home, that forgiveness is possible without forgetting, that healing takes time and requires honesty, that protecting yourself doesn't mean giving up on someone you love, and that no manipulation, no matter how sophisticated, can permanently destroy the connection between a mother and the child she raised with her whole heart. Margaret unlocked her apartment door and stepped inside. The space was quiet, but it didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt like home. A home that had once sheltered a struggling single mother and her young son. A home that had been the site of countless sacrifices and quiet triumphs. A home that had waited, patient and steady, for its lost child to return. She made herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker to life below. Tomorrow, James was coming for dinner. He was bringing that new girl he had been seeing. The kind one, the genuine one, the one who understood that loving James meant respecting the mother who made him who he was. Margaret smiled, sipping her tea, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. The journey had been brutal. The pain had been almost unbearable. But they had made it through. Together. And whatever came next, whatever challenges and joys and ordinary moments awaited them, they would face it the same way, as mother and son. Unbreakable, unbowed, and finally, fully home.